Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has been living in a new era of diplomacy. The world's only superpower finds itself dealing differently with both friends and enemies in the absence of a major competing nation. Successive U.S. administrations have been struggling with this problem now for a quarter of a century. The terror attacks of 9/11 and their aftermath have turned out to isolate the U.S. even more. Today, presidential candidates debate the merits of talking to or shunning U.S. enemies. Experts worry about how America is perceived by other countries. Today, the U.S. can't take its allies for granted either. Many refuse to support the U.S. invasion of Iraq. What does the future hold for U.S. foreign policy? Does Washington have the clout it once did? Is the word superpower itself even relevant anymore? We'll look at these and other issues next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.
Around the world, the administration of George W. Bush is widely considered to be among the most unilateral in modern history. Mr. Bush disengaged from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, at first refused to speak to governments in Iran and North Korea about their nuclear programs, and perhaps most notably went to war in Iraq over the objections of much of the international community. Many feel the United States left them on the wrong side when President Bush famously declared after 9/11, "You're either with us or against us." With the Iraq War dragging on years after he thought it would end and public and congressional opinion sharply down from the post-9/11 days, Mr. Bush's approach seems to be changing. In the last 6 months, formal talks have begun with Iran and Syria aimed at quelling the violence in Iraq. The administration has agreed to provide aid to North Korea if it halts its nuclear program. And there's been a U.S. diplomatic push to revive peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians.
Those conversations have to be ongoing, they have to be sustained, they have to be at a very high level in order to make any progress.
Why, after going it alone for so long, has the United States begun talking? Some believe that losses in Iraq and the war's ever-growing unpopularity mean the U.S. can no longer afford to turn its back to other nations' views. Some suggest the initial hard line was a tactic to set the stage for favorable negotiations. A number of top U.S. officials have left, notably former Secretaries of State and Defense Colin Powell and Donald Rumsfeld, making way for changing policy. Under changing circumstances, how far would this or a future administration be willing to go? With whom would the U.S. negotiate? The Palestinian group Hamas, for example, is classified as a terrorist organization by the United States, yet Hamas was democratically elected to run the Palestinian government. Can the United States balance its desire for a negotiated settlement between the Palestinians and Israelis with its commitment to the war on terror? Does the designation terrorist mean no negotiations under any circumstances? The U.S. faced this same question almost 2 decades ago when Yasser Arafat was called a terrorist, but Washington ultimately included him in talks with Israel. Never before has the U.S. been so dominant internationally, but so vulnerable at the same time. How long can this situation go on? Was it unavoidable? Has U.S. international standing been irrevocably damaged? Or has this episode made Washington stronger in some ways? And how might future administrations proceed when the White House changes hands next January? Dangerous dialogue, talking with the enemy, next on Great Decisions.
And now from our New York studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. To help us talk about the future of U.S. diplomacy and whether the United States should speak with its enemies, we have Donald Gregg, former U.S. ambassador to South Korea and chairman of the Korea Society and former advisor to Vice President Bush, also a former CIA analyst. And John Whitehead, former Deputy Secretary of State in the administration of Ronald Reagan. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So, should the United States talk to its enemies or shun them? Don?
I don't want to make a general statement on that, but more often than not, I think talking is much better than shunning. And even worse than shunning is demonizing, which is something that we've had a tendency to do from time to time. We demonized Ho Chi Minh, we demonized Kim Jong-il, and that makes it harder to start the kind of dialogue with people like that that can eventually help us avoid hostilities and lead to a diplomatic solution.
Calling the Soviet Union an evil empire wouldn't lead to discussions with the Soviet Union?
Well, President Reagan did that, but then he didn't live by that statement. He knew what Gorbachev represented, and he had a terrific dialogue with Gorbachev. And I think he played a tremendous role in ending the Cold War without a shot being fired through his dialogue with Gorbachev.
John Whitehead, you were around at that time and in the Reagan administration. Did the president make a switch, or did he feel basically that you shouldn't talk with an enemy and then...
No, I think the president, in my memory, often talked with enemies and was very good at it. And his relationship with Gorbachev is a good example of how he softened the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States and helped lead to a solution of the Cold War.
President Reagan famously or infamously also talked with Iran during his administration. He didn't do that publicly, he did that privately, and then it was disclosed, I think much to his chagrin. Today, the United States faces a continuing confrontation with Iran. Should the U.S. be talking to Iran now?
Yes, I think as a general rule that talking with your enemies is a good thing, and that we should not hesitate to do it. And there's a tendency to demonize our enemies, as Don has said, and I think talking with them instead is the way that you can find solutions.
But I can't help pointing out the contradiction in what you're both saying here. President Reagan was the one who said, we won't negotiate with terrorists, and then he was the one who sent a secret negotiator to negotiate with the Iranian regime. How do you square those two things?
Well,
how can you say on the one hand, yes, we should talk to our enemies, but on the other, and not demonize them, on the other hand, call them evil empire and terrorists?
There are different ways of talking to people, and you sometimes talk to people privately in a different way than you talk with them publicly. But to continue to communicate with our enemies in some way is extremely important. I've always thought that the United States is crazy to close its embassies when we find somebody that we declare to be our enemy. That's just the time when we need the embassies, when we need multiple contacts with a country.
Don, I'm not sure what position you were in at the time, but when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, one of the first things the U.S. did at that time was essentially withdraw all diplomatic personnel from Afghanistan.
Well, we'd had an ambassador shot and killed there, Spike Dubs, a very good man. And we did not have very good relations with the puppet leader that we were dealing with, and it was a very dangerous situation. But I think we would have done better. But going back to the Iranian example, I think if you start talking with somebody with whom you have a hostile relationship, you have to know the history of that relationship. And part of our problem with Iran is that in the early 1950s, we overthrew Mr. Mossadegh, put the Shah back on the throne in Iran. And the Iranians have never forgotten that nor forgiven us for it. And so when President Reagan reached out to the Iranians in the Iran-Contra thing, he was doing it secretly, and he was sort of violating some principles. And I think we had forgotten how angry the Iranians, who have a very proud history, are about the fact that we overthrew the man who they had as their legitimate leader because he'd nationalized his oil. And the Brits didn't like it, and we didn't like it. The Dulles brothers were in power, and they had a list of 8 countries where we were going to have regime change. And it was Iran, Guatemala, and Cuba, and that was just a disastrous litany of failure.
Do you think that history between the United States and Iran is playing out today in the dealings with Iran over the war in Iraq?
Absolutely.
How so?
Well, I think they have a proud history going back thousands of years. They feel humiliated by what we did to them. The Shah was very unpopular. He had a brutal intelligence service, and we are seen as somebody who meddled in their internal affairs in the name of oil. And it takes a proud people a long time to forget something like that.
Now in the war in Iraq, the United States finds itself having to deal with other neighbors in the region, It's dealing with other Arab states. It's, of course, dealing heavily involved with the Iraqi government, but essentially refusing to talk in any substantive way with the Iranian government. In your view, is that a good thing, John?
No, I would always want to keep the lines of communication open with a country like Iran, particularly important now. I was surprised and distressed when recently Ahmadinejad, their principal leader now in Iran, came to New York to attend a United Nations session and asked if he could go to Ground Zero and lay a wreath in memory of those that were killed at Ground Zero. I interpreted that as a gesture of friendship to the United States, something we've been looking for with Iran for years and haven't seen. And we rebuffed the man who came to America and wanted, if he did anything while he was here, he wanted to show respect to those who were killed, even by his own hand and the hand of terrorists that he may have controlled. I thought it was a missed opportunity to establish a more friendly relationship with Iran, which is would be very much in our interest.
You think that was a gesture on the part of the Iranian government to open a negotiation?
I think it could have been interpreted that way. Yes, I think we should have assumed it was a friendly gesture and hoped that it was a friendly gesture.
The United States, of course, has accused Iran of fomenting anti-American violence inside Iraq.
Right.
Let's listen to Lee Hamilton, who is the chairman of the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Studies in Washington and was the co-chair of the Iraq Study Group. Great Decisions asked him about the question of whether Iran ought to be brought into negotiations.
I don't think it's possible to say, okay, we're going to sit down with our friends, the Saudis, and we're going to sit down with our friends, the Jordanians, and solve the problems of Iraq. In the best of all worlds, maybe that's the way it would work, but you can't leave out some of our adversaries. Iran is a major player in Iraq. We may not like that, but it's a fact. And if you're going to deal with Iraq and try to bring it together as a country, you cannot ignore the power, the influence, the presence of Iran.
Of course, Iran has been and is a major presence not just in Iraq but in the entire Persian Gulf region and in the Middle East. The U.S. accuses Iran, for example, of instigating Hezbollah in Lebanon and aiding and abetting Hamas in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So there may be other reasons to talk to Iran. Do you think the United States has missed a boat in all these years by not engaging in a relationship with this government, which the United States doesn't like?
Yes, I do. I was seconded to the Carter administration and was there during the seizure of the American embassy. And so an awful lot of our hostility toward Iran goes back to that. And we really have not had any kind of dialogue with them since then. And Ahmadinejad's position in Iran is not that secure. Iran is not a totalitarian society. There are a lot of young Iranians who still have a great interest in the United States. And I think that we strengthen Ahmadinejad by sort of allowing him to point to the pressure that we're putting on him. I think if we were to open up a dialogue with him, I think that would resonate very well within Iran and would make it easier for people who would like to cooperate with us to perhaps have a stronger voice against Ahmadinejad.
Let me follow up on the point you just made and your reference to preventing Ahmadinejad from laying a wreath at Ground Zero, for example. Does the United States also lose credibility, not just inside Iran, as you mentioned, but also in other parts of the world where people say you have opportunities, the United States have opportunities, but you miss them? Do we lose credibility with others, not just with the Iranians?
Yes, I think refusing to talk with anybody is a reprehensible thing to do, and that other nations, our friends and enemies, would believe that it was a negative for the United States to refuse to talk with anybody in the world.
You know, the United States also has suffered criticism, and Don, I think as a former ambassador to South Korea, you'll know about this, and I think you've said you've visited North Korea several times,
yes.
Right? People say to the United States, if you're so concerned about North Korea's nuclear program, just as you're concerned about Iran's, why don't you talk to North Korea? Why don't the United States talk to North Korea?
Well, it's very confusing to the North Koreans, among others. During my first trip, the North Koreans were very confused because Bill Clinton had come very close to visiting them. He had sent his Secretary of State, who had 11 hours of discussion with Chairman Kim Jong-il. And then when George W. Bush was elected, a completely different line was taken. And the North Koreans asked me, he said, how do you function when one of your presidents is so different from his predecessor? And why is George W. Bush so different from his father? I mean, they had a whole series of interesting questions. And because we didn't talk for 6.5 years, North Korea became a nuclear power. They were very close to negotiating away a much more primitive nuclear capacity at the end of the Clinton administration. But because they were called part of the axis of evil, along with Iran and Iraq, because President Bush referred to Kim Jong-il as a pygmy and said, I loathe the man, that made it very difficult for us to have any kind of dialogue. The Koreans are very proud people, but they have wanted for a long time to have a strategic relationship with us. But we made it very difficult for that to come about because we essentially trashed them and were pushing for regime change. Now, fortunately, President Bush, in the last couple of years of his presidency, has changed. I think Condoleezza Rice has made him realize that diplomacy applies to your enemies as well as your friends, and has allowed the Assistant Secretary of State, Chris Hill, a very able man, to have bilateral talks with the North Koreans, and that's laid the ground for what appears to be an agreement through which they will abolish their nuclear weapons in return for recognition from us and establishment of peaceful relations.
Is it fair to say, you think, that the agreement, the outlines of which you just indicated, is fairly similar to the agreement that was reached in the mid-1990s?
Yes, it is quite similar. And one of the difficulties with the early years of the Bush administration was that they had the ABC doctrine, which was anything but Clinton, and anything that Bill Clinton had done they didn't want to follow up on. But they have come back to it, and I'm very glad that they have.
But the reason I'm asking is on this question of whether you talk to your enemies. In this case, would it be fair to say that the United States lost essentially 10 years, maybe 12 years, in its dealings with this nuclear problem on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I think they have lost certainly 6 years of the Bush presidency, and North Korea became a nuclear power during that time. Ironically, that made the North Koreans a little more confident, because they have said to me repeatedly, the only reason we're pursuing nuclear option is a deterrent to you. So they are a little more confident in talking to us, and the fact that we are talking now has, I think, paved the way for an agreement to be reached.
John Whitehead, I know you've been involved in discussions like this as well with North Korea and with others. The United States has had no hesitation, or very little hesitation, to go to war against Iraq when it thought Iraq had nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. It's much more reluctant to do so against Iran, and has been reluctant to do so against North Korea. Others may say, what's the difference? Why do you parse one a certain way and the other a different way?
Well, if you do one and it doesn't work out very well, you're reluctant to do a second one. That's an oversimplification of the situation, but I think it was an important, simple explanation of the present status of relationships. I certainly hope that we will not go to war with Iran, and I don't believe there's any intention on anybody's part to do so. I'd like to say that in the 4 years that I spent in the State Department, I was involved with a lot of talks with a lot of country leaders. And I'm a great believer in diplomacy after my experience with that. If you talk with a person on a friendly, private basis, you often find that a standoff between the two of you where you have opposite positions is not really that. And in a conversation you can often discover, and I did often discover, that what they wanted could be accomplished and what we wanted could also be accomplished. That the point that the disagreement was not just a direct disagreement, that there were sort of overlappings, and you could arrive at a decision if you kept an open mind and kept the conversations going and began to have confidence in the person that you were conversing with. You could often open up new approaches that often led to successful conclusions. And I I had so many examples of that happening and working that I just believe it's a great general rule is to keep talking all the time.
During the Reagan administration in which you served, the president and others in the administration repeatedly referred to Yasser Arafat and the PLO as terrorists, and that there would be no negotiations with terrorists. At the very end of the Reagan administration, I think it was December of 1988, the administration decided to open the door to negotiations with Yasser Arafat, and that, of course, led to further agreements in the early 1990s, the Madrid Peace Conference eventually, and things like that. My question to you is, today, the United States faces a democratically elected Hamas government in the Palestinian territory of the Gaza Strip, and yet the United States will not meet with or negotiate with Hamas leaders. Is that the right step to take?
I think not. I think without the United States participation, it's unlikely that there will be any conclusion of good results between the Palestinians and the United States.
So you think it would actually be
Israel.
You think it would be better for Israel's future and the United States' future if the U.S. negotiated with Hamas?
Yes, absolutely.
How about you, Don? Have you thought about that one?
Well, we encouraged an election in Lebanon and votes in Palestine, and the people we didn't like won. And so I think we have to live with the results of plebiscites and so forth. Yes, I think we ought to talk, and I think we're moving in that direction now.
You can speak out, we should speak out against terrorism by any of the parties and condemn it. But that doesn't mean we have to stop talking with them. We can do both at once.
And that's all the more reason to talk to Iran, because Iran is the great supporter, supposedly, of Hamas. And so I think that's all the more reason to talk with Iran, to see if we can't come to some sort of accommodation so that an agreement can be reached.
In the Middle East, things are always intertwined and intertangled and so on. Iran keeps coming back, a supporter of Hamas, a supporter of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. The U.S. accuses it of anti-American work inside Iraq. Great Decisions talk with Jessica Matthews, who's the president of the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, about Syria, with whom also the United States has had tense relationship, and Iraq.
Syria wants to talk to us. They've been knocking on the door for 2 years, and the Bush administration has ignored them. Iran is going to be much, much tougher for the administration and for Congress. But we have to do it because there is just, if finding a solution in Iraq is the #1 priority, that makes dealing with Iran the #1 priority too.
So she raised a point about Congress's role in all of this. It's not really just up to the president or the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor. You've got to get congressional support, at least the indication that Congress will not oppose you strongly. Do you think Congress ought to be more closely brought into these dealings with American enemies?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think we should find ways in situations which I handled in Washington. Having one of my responsibilities was to deal with the satellite states of Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia and the others about their position with the Soviet Union, and I tried to make little chinks in their loyalty to the Soviets. And one of the things I found was that they wanted to be friendly to the United States. They were fearful that Russia would clamp down on them if they evidenced that. But their desire was to, one of their Soviet puppet leaders said, "We are a Western European country. We don't want to be an Eastern European country." And eventually that's what will happen. Well, now, when you hear that from a country that you thought was your enemy, it was conversations that brought out their reminder that they really belonged on our side of the Cold War. And that's when we finished with our discussions with them in the years that I was there, that's what they were. They were much more friendly to the United States.
A final comment on a country that is not perceived as an enemy. In fact, it's an ally of the United States. Turkey is a NATO ally of the United States. But in the last few years, public opinion in Turkey toward the United States has plummeted to the point where public opinion surveys now show many Turks don't like the United States. Yet they're an ally. There's a case where should diplomacy, more intense diplomacy perhaps with Turkey over the war in Iraq, Could it have made a difference?
I would think so. I would think it could have.
I think the current problem with Turkey centers on the Kurds. The Kurds are more friendly to us than any of the other ethnic groups in Iraq, and the Turks are terribly afraid of Kurdish independence. But that is a big problem between us and Turkey, and we need to talk about it all the time.
Donald Gregg, former U.S. Ambassador to South Korea, Chairman of the Korea Society, and John Whitehead, former Deputy Secretary of State in the administration of Ronald Reagan. Thank you both for being with us on Great Decisions. And thank you as well for joining us on Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.